The gunshot cracked the silence at 4 in the morning. Esther Mwamba woke before her body understood why. Her ears had learned, over 61 years of marriage, to read the night the way sailors read the sky. The sound had come from the eastern edge of the mango grove, where the bush road bent around the termite mound her husband Joseph had warned her about 1,000 times. "Stay down," Joseph whispered from the floor beside the bed. His voice was wrong, wet. He held his arm across his stomach, and blood was running through the fingers she'd once held open-mouthed for their newborn son. If stories like this move you, if a story about an old man bleeding in the dark and his wife refusing to let go can make you feel something real, hit subscribe, like the video, and drop one word in the comments before we go any further. Because what these two dogs did next still keeps me awake at night. The men outside were not strangers. Joseph had known Kabwe Mwila for 38 years. They had hunted together as boys. They had shared a cooking pot in the dry season of 1983 when the rains forgot to come. They had laughed at the same jokes about white tourists who paid good money to photograph the same leopards their grandfathers had worshipped. And in 1996, Joseph had stood in a magistrate's courtroom in Lusaka and pointed his finger at this same Kabwe and said, in a voice that did not shake, "This man killed 11 elephants in one night. I watched him do it." Now Kabwe was back, and he had brought his sons. Esther pulled Joseph behind the steel wardrobe her late sister had sent from Lusaka 7 years ago. The wardrobe would not stop a bullet. It would not stop a machete. But it was the only barrier between her husband and the men whose voices she could now hear moving through the kitchen, knocking pans off the open shelves with the casual grace of men who had decided nobody in this house was going to live through sunrise. "We should have gone to Lusaka," she said, and hated herself for it. "Never," Joseph said, and the word cost him air. Their house stood on the eastern edge of Kafue, the kind of land the government forgot about when it drew its maps, the kind of land that didn't have a deed because the Mwambas had been burying their dead on it for 7 generations. 63 acres of mopane and miombo, of dried riverbeds and beehives in hollow trees, of heat and quiet, and the kind of stars Joseph's city-raised son had only ever seen on a screen. Their son, Tafadzwa, had left 17 years ago. He had left because of the dogs. It had happened in November of 2008, 3 days before Tafadzwa's 12th birthday. Joseph had been checking the snares along the southern fence when his radio crackled, and a young ranger's voice told him one of his dogs, a scrappy black and tan mongrel with one torn ear and the temperament of a small, angry god, had caught his foot in a steel trap near the dry riverbed. The ranger said, "Bring wire cutters, bring the truck, bring a strong heart." Joseph had run. He had run past the place where his wife was hanging laundry. He had run past the place where Tafadzwa was swimming with 2 neighborhood boys in the dam by the baobab tree. He had heard the boys shouting his son's name from across the water, and he had stopped, and he had looked, and the choice had taken him less than a heartbeat. He had run toward the dog. The dog had lived. Tafadzwa had not. Joseph still did not know what had pulled the boy under. He had chosen a snared dog over his own son, and 17 years later, the wound had not closed, because Tafadzwa had never come home, never sent a message on the boy's birthday, never said any of the things a son says to a father who killed him without meaning to. The black and tan dog had grown old on the Mwamba porch. They called him Dume. The other dog had come 3 years later, a quiet, brindle female the Mwambas had saved from a snare of their own. They called her Kito, which means star in Bemba, because she had been found under a tree on a night so clear the stars had seemed to fall into the grass and lie there waiting to be picked up. Dume guarded the house. Quito guarded the people. You did not pet Dume from the front, and you did not walk past Quito in the dark without saying her name loudly. Tonight, both dogs were gone. Joseph had sent them out 2 hours before the gunshot, when he had smelled tobacco on the wind. Something is wrong, he'd told Esther, and she had nodded, because she had smelled it too. The sweet, sharp tobacco smoke poachers used to cover their scent from the antelope. The dogs had already been at the eastern fence. They had heard the trucks long before the humans had. Joseph had watched them go from the porch. Dume had walked close to Quito. Quito had walked close to Dume. He had thought then, they will come back. They always come back. They will lick my hand and tell me what the bush is saying. But the bush was saying the bush was about to break. Inside the house, Joseph pressed his palm against the wound in his arm and felt the warm, wet pulse that told him the bullet was still inside. Esther had already tied a strip of cloth around it, torn from the wedding wrapper she had carried through every harvest and every funeral and every empty Christmas she had spent in this house without Tafadzwa. The cloth was the color of the dust outside. "Kabwe wants the copper," Joseph said. In 2019, a South African geologist had quietly drilled core samples on the Mwamba land and discovered a vein of copper so rich it had made the front page of the Zambian business section. The company had sent a polite letter. The company had then sent a lawyer. Joseph had refused. Esther had refused. They had refused together, then alone, then together again, and the company had moved on to other lands. Until Kabwe Mwila had come back from prison in May with 2 sons and a quiet promise to clear everything the Mwambas had ever loved. "Kabwe doesn't want the copper," Esther said, half to herself. "He wants you to know he wants the copper." Joseph understood this too. In 1996, he had stood up at a public meeting and named Kabwe's accomplices by their nicknames. He had never apologized. He had never hidden. He had stayed, and tonight, Kabwe had finally come back to tell him what staying had cost. A chair crashed over in the kitchen. A man's voice, low and patient, said, "Old man, we know where you are." Dume was not in the house. Quito was not in the house. Esther's breath caught. "Where are the dogs, Joseph? Where are the dogs? Where did you send them, Joseph? Where are the dogs?" And Joseph, for the first time in his life, lied to his wife. "I don't know," he said. The truth was worse. He had not sent the dogs out to bark. He had sent them out to get help. 2 hours before the gunshot, Joseph had knelt in the dust beside Dume's scarred old head and pressed his forehead against the dog's muzzle. He had whispered the only direction a dog could understand. South, down the gravel road, past the fallen baobab, past the cattle dip, past the gate with the rusted chain and the sign that said Mwamba Homestead in faded blue paint. He had whispered the name of the nearest neighbor, Mrs. Nyirongo, who lived 3 kilometers south and who owned a phone. He had said the word Musa, the name of her teenage grandson, who sometimes came to the Mwamba house to bring maize meal and ask Dume to chase the chickens out of the cassava patch. Dume had understood. Quito had understood. Bitches, Joseph knew, were better at directions than dogs. And so the question now eating the air between Joseph and Esther was not whether the dogs were alive. The question was whether Quito understood her job tonight, or stopped at the fallen baobab, or turned left at the cattle dip, or whether the trucks had caught her before Mrs. Nyirongo's gate. A door slammed open. A flashlight swept the hallway. The beam caught the corner of the wardrobe where Joseph was leaning. It moved on. It came back. The man holding the light whistled once, low. Two shadows moved past the doorway, toward the back of the house, toward the room where Tafadzwa had once slept. "Find the dogs first," Cowboy's voice said from somewhere outside. "The dogs will know. The dogs will bark if we're not careful. Find them and string them up before the old man makes another mistake." Esther closed her eyes. She could not pray. She had not prayed since the morning she had gone to identify Tafadzwa's body at the Lusaka University Teaching Hospital and found that the boy already looked like Joseph. The strong jaw, the closed mouth, the same stubborn tilt of the head, the same way of holding grief in his spine, as if grief were a sack of maize he had to carry from the field to the granary without stopping. She had stood in that fluorescent hallway with a receipt in her hand and thought, this is what Joseph has been doing for 20 years. Carrying it, walking with it, putting it down only when he thinks nobody is watching, putting it down only in front of the dogs. If Joseph had been drowning today, Esther thought, he would have saved Dume again, and she would have hated him again. But the dogs were gone. The dogs were gone because Joseph had decided, once in his life, that choosing the dog over his son had been the right thing, and that if the world was going to take his wife, his land, his house, and the 7 generations buried under the mopane trees tonight, it was going to have to do it without the 2 living things he had chosen over everything else. Quito, however, had not gone south. Quito had remembered something. 3 weeks before, a small gray Land Cruiser had pulled up to the Mwamba gate, and a young woman in a green medical coat had stepped out. She had not announced herself. She had walked up the gravel path with a stethoscope around her neck and a backpack on her shoulders, and she had said, in a voice that knew exactly how to talk to a dog and exactly how to talk to a man who was pretending not to be in pain, "I am Tafadzwa's daughter. My name is Nandi. I am a veterinary surgeon in Lusaka. I have come to look at your dogs." Joseph had not hidden. Esther had not hidden. Nandi had knelt on the dust. She had pressed her stethoscope to Dume's chest. She had looked up at Joseph with the same tilt of the head she had never seen in a mirror, because she had never met her father. And she had said, "Your dogs are dying, Mr. Mwamba. They have lived longer than any dogs I have ever treated. I would like to come back every week and love them until they are ready to go." That had been 3 weeks ago. Quito had not gone south. Quito had gone north, down the dirt track toward the gravel road, past the fallen baobab, past the cattle dip, past the Mwamba gate. She had run, alone, in the dark, 22 kilometers to the small guest lodge where Nandi Mwamba spent her weekends, because it was the closest place to her grandfather's land that her mother would let her stay alone. Nandi had been sleeping under a single mosquito net, with a paperback novel open on her chest, with her phone still in her hand because her mother never stopped calling. Quito had arrived at midnight. She had thrown herself against the door of the cabin until the wood began to splinter. Nandi had woken. She had opened the door. Quito had walked in, had walked straight to her, had laid her chin on Nandi's bare foot, and had looked up. It was 4 in the morning. It was 4 in the morning when Nandi understood that no dog in the world runs 22 kilometers in the dark for any reason other than the one reason that dogs know and humans have to be taught. She had grabbed her keys. She had called the police dispatcher on the only network that worked on this stretch of bush, and she had driven south, fast, The way you drive when the only two people in the world who have ever loved you unconditionally are about to die at the hands of men who do not believe unconditional love exists. Inside the Mwamba house, Kabwe Mwila had given up his patience. He had pushed open the bedroom door. He had walked in with a flashlight in one hand and a machete in the other. And the machete was not new, and the flashlight was missing a piece of its plastic casing. And the man holding both had the same crooked smile Joseph had once teased him for at the harvest dance of 1981. "Old man," Kabwe said, "I am going to count to 3. Esther stepped out from behind the wardrobe. For a long moment, nobody in the room moved. "Put it down, Kabwe," Esther said, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had buried her son, and her mother, and her sister, and her sister's husband, and 2 of her sister's children, and had cooked for rabid dogs and dying strangers, and had not allowed herself to break once. "Put it down and let me pour you tea. We can talk about what is owed. But put it down, because if I have to watch you kill my husband in front of me, I will follow him before the body is cold." Kabwe hesitated. He remembered Esther's mother. He remembered the woman who carried an axe on her hip on market day and could lift a sack of cassava that half the men at the mill could not lift. He remembered that the Mwamba women were not women you tested twice. "1," Kabwe said. Then Dume came through the window. He came through it the way he had come through 3 doors and 2 fences and 1 chain-link gate in his life. Silently, fast, and exactly where the man holding a weapon did not expect him. His old body had nothing left in it except what was inside his chest. The first bullet caught him in the shoulder. The second caught him in the hip. The third caught him in the ribs, and he did not make a sound, and he did not stop. And his teeth found the wrist of the hand holding the machete, and he held on. Joseph had never told Esther the truth about Dume. The truth was that in 2008, when Joseph had run to the snare, he had known that his son was in the water. He had known that his son could swim. He had known that the dog could not. He had calculated, in the part of his heart that no human being ever admits to, that one of them was going to die that morning, and that he could not bear to be the parent who let the dog die alone in the cold. He had chosen, and the dog had lived. And the dog had guarded the house for 17 years, because that was the only way a dog knows how to say, "I am sorry. I am sorry. I am sorry for what you did to keep me here. Let me stay a little longer. Let me guard 1 more door. Let me die in the room where your son used to sleep." Dume died on the floor of the room where Tafadzwa had once slept. He died with the machete still in his mouth. Kabwe screamed. He kicked the dog's body. He kicked it again. Esther did not look away. Joseph did not look away. The youngest of Kabwe's sons, a boy not yet 20, turned his face to the wall. And in that pause, a sound came from the gravel road. It was the sound of a small gray Land Cruiser driving past the fallen baobab without slowing down. It was the sound of a woman named Nandi coming home for the first time in her life. It was the sound of a phone call that had reached a police dispatcher who was the grandson of a man Joseph had once saved from a snare in 1979. The Land Cruiser came around the corner of the house. The headlights came on. Nandi did not park. She drove straight at Kabwe. Kabwe dove sideways. The car hit the porch pillar. The pillar fell inward. The men who had come to clear the land suddenly understood that the land was not empty. Nandi got out. She stood in the headlights. She wore a green coat that was too thin for the cold, and her hands were shaking, and she held a pistol she had borrowed from a friend at the lodge. And she said, in a voice her father would have recognized from across a crowded room, "I am Tafadzwa's daughter. My grandfather is Joseph Mwamba. You have 3 seconds to put down every weapon in this house and lie face down on the floor." 2. Cowboy looked at her. He looked at Joseph. He lay down on the floor. The police came 40 minutes later. 3 trucks, 8 officers, a young commander who had grown up hearing the name Mwamba spoken with the kind of respect a region gives the people who never moved away. Joseph held the dog's body until Esther made him let go. She wrapped Dume in a piece of cloth the color of the house, the color of the dust, the color of the year 2008, and she carried the body outside. And Nandi helped her, and the 2 of them laid the dog under the baobab tree where Tafadzwa had gone swimming the morning his father chose a different life. "Nandi," Esther said. "Yes, grandmother." "Your grandfather is not a good man." Nandi looked at her. "I know. He chose this dog over your father." "Grandmother." "He did." Nandi was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "This dog died for you tonight." Esther understood. She understood that she was not going to forgive Joseph in this lifetime. Not for the empty chair at Christmas. Not for the unsent letters. Not for the silence that had grown in this house like moss on a grave. But she understood, too, that somewhere under that baobab tree there was now a creature who had loved Joseph without conditions, and who had asked for nothing in return except the chance to lay down his life in the room where Tafadzwa had once slept. She looked at Joseph. She had not forgiven him. She would never forgive him. But she had not left. And she was not going to leave. Joseph sat on the ground beside the dog's grave. He did not speak. He had not spoken since Nandi had arrived. He sat with his hands in his lap, and his head bowed, and his mouth moving in a shape that looked like prayer but was not. And Esther sat down beside him, and Nandi knelt in the dirt beside Esther. And Quito walked out of the dark and pressed her head into the hollow of Joseph's elbow. The moon began to set. The bush began to call. Quito did not leave. She had not come home. She had brought a stranger home. A grandchild Joseph had never held. A granddaughter who had grown up on the wrong end of a silence Esther had refused to break. A young woman with a stethoscope and a pistol, and the tilt of a head she had inherited from a father who had never seen her. Joseph put his hand on Quito's neck. He did not speak. He did not need to. Because sometimes the ones who love us most don't speak our language. They just refuse to leave. Will you stay? Or will you let stories like this one disappear? Leave one word in the comments below.